Hello, welcome to our online learning hub. My name is Erin Hamilton and I am from Blast Intermediate Unit 17. Today I'm going to bring you some information that is taken from Patton's Literacy Symposium back in 2020 regarding the top 5 MTSS implementation errors and how can we correct them for better reading outcomes. Our goals for this presentation are that you will walk away with an idea of how to use the MTSS model to deliver your services to students to prevent reading failures and also to improve our reading outcomes, specifically for elementary students. So if your school is not getting to at least that 80% of students getting proficient on those benchmark reading goals, this session hopefully will provide specific ideas for your focused improvement. Let's begin by talking about what is MTSS. Hopefully this pyramid is something you've seen prior to today's presentation. So if you look at the green, we're hoping that when we give a benchmark assessment to our students, about 80% of our students are falling in that proficient to advanced category. With those results, we're also expecting that we're going to have students who need that strategic support. And our goal is to have no more than 15 to 20% of our students fall into that category. And with all benchmark assessments, we see students who need that intensive support outside of their core instruction. And hopefully that is also no larger than 5%. So this continuum of support that we give our students depends on their outcomes on their benchmarks. This is one example of an outcome-driven model that is used with Acadian's reading benchmark assessments. So in the outcomes-driven model, there are really 5 steps for achieving these goals. Step 1 is to identify the need for support. So that comes when you give your benchmark assessments to your students in the fall, the winter, and then again in the spring. And after you identify the need for support, we validate the need with those benchmark assessments, seeing where they're at on their assessment and also having conversations with their classroom teachers on what they're seeing in the classroom. Once the identification is made and we validate that need, we need to make a plan. What interventions are we going to put in place for those students to receive better reading outcomes, and how are we going to narrow that achievement gap with those students? So we plan for that support and also implement the support. So notice the green box towards the bottom there. That is a constant revolving circle. We plan for the support, we implement the support, and then step 4 is making sure that we're evaluating how effective those interventions are. So with Acadians, they recommend that you're progress monitoring throughout the way. And if you're progress monitoring and you're seeing the rate of improvement or the student growth on the correct rate, then we know our intervention is working. However, if we evaluate that effectiveness and we see that our students are plateauing or unfortunately decreasing in their understanding, then we would need to make a shift in our implementation. Go back to the drawing board with that planning, step 3, rewrite our plan and implement it again. Finally, number 5 is reviewing outcomes. So prior to giving that next benchmark, we would want to see where our students, their growth and where their improvement was. That's just one example. And again, that comes from Acadian's reading. So the topic for today are MTSS mess ups and what are some of us misunderstanding about MTSS. So here are the top 5 according to Stephanie Stoller's presentation through Patton's Literacy Symposium. Her top 5 are, number 1, saying you're, quote, doing MTSS, but you're actually still doing the same old practices. The second one she talks about is using 3 tiers to talk about students. Number 3, not using tier 1 for primary prevention. And tier 1 is really that core instruction. The 4th mess up we often see is not using a collaborative problem-solving process. And the 5th one we're going to talk about here is using placement in special education as the solution for not seeing the growth from students. So each one of these, quote, mess ups, we're going to dig a little deeper on throughout our presentation. So let's start with the first one. Stephanie talked about saying you're, quote, doing MTSS, but you're still actually doing the same old practices. And this happens a lot in our school districts where we do the same old teacher makes a referral, our school psychologist does the testing, and then we make the suggestion of the placement to the parents. Also with that, we sometimes get stuck in removing kids from our regular classroom to get that support. Or sometimes we say things like, you're gonna go see the MTSS teacher, or you're going to go to the MTSS room, or we'll catch up on that during MTSS time. And so all of those things are red flags for you if you're seeing or hearing that in your district, because MTSS multi-tiered systems of support is really a systematic process that we're doing as a district or as a building, not necessarily during 30-minute block of our school day, not necessarily with one teacher doing the interventions. So making sure that we're really taking a deep look into that mess up number one. Let me take you back just a little bit and remind you that MTSS was created as an alternative to several things. Here's a long list of things that MTSS was hopeful to create to take all of these things out of the equation. So for example, that last bullet there, waiting for a deficit to fail first and then intervening. Instead, multi-tiered systems of support is a way to get in there and intervene prior to seeing a deficit. There's other examples here of things that it was created as an alternative to. For example, dependent on teacher referral. Hopefully our teachers are seeing gaps in their students' understanding through benchmark testing 3 times a year, but also through progress monitoring that they're doing in the classroom. So multi-tiered systems of support is a way to be fluid in where your students are getting interventions, how often, and if whether it's with the classroom teacher or with an intervention specialist. There are several other on the list. Feel free to look through that. So why should you have this 3-tiered model? Well, there's a list here for you, and this is not all. However, these were the top 4 that I felt that Stephanie highlighted in her presentation. So let's be honest and know that intervention is expensive. It's hard. So we need to make sure that we're preventing these gaps and making sure that we're getting that support in there with our students in tier 1, that first tier, the core instruction that's happening in every classroom, because we know that effective instruction practices happen in that core instruction. So if we are getting our benchmark data back and we're seeing that more than that 15% is strategic and more than that 5% is intensive, then it needs to go back and have a really good look at what our core instruction is doing in that first tier, all students getting the same information. If we're doing something wrong in tier 1, we need to strengthen that core prior to worrying about any interventions. The last bullet there is really important as well. We need to make sure that we have a collaborative problem-solving team where our teachers are really working with each other. They're working with special education teachers. They're working with intervention specialists. They're working with Title I teachers. They're working with administrators. And we're all a team together where we can problem solve what is the rock that's standing in the way of this student's learning. Mess up number 2. Oftentimes you hear teachers, administrators talk about their red kids or their green kids or their yellow kids. And this oftentimes comes on after we see a benchmark result, right? So our benchmark result has our green kids, sometimes referred to as green kids. There are core students that are achieving that benchmark proficient or advanced, and they're showing effective growth. Our students that are in strategic, that 15 to 20% who really need a little bit more support or more intervention, they're often referred to as our yellow kids. And then the final category I spoke of, the red kids, are often those students that are showing up on benchmark assessments to really need that intensive support. So we really need to make sure that instead of calling them our green kids or our red kids, that we're talking more about what their needs are and what their learning gaps are. Because ultimately we want to provide support for 100% of our students to reach those benchmark goals. So we want to make sure we're checking and seeing what those boundaries are and why are our students not making that goal of 100% reaching benchmark. At Acadience Reading, again, they use those colors to talk about what are the odds of our students making the benchmark the next time we give it to them. So for example, those green kids I mentioned that people refer to sometimes, students that are receiving scores that come out at or above benchmark, the odds of them getting to benchmark the next time that we check their reading outcomes is generally about 80 to 90%. Whereas you can see that percentage significantly decreases depending on their score on their benchmark. Let's go to mess up number 3. This one, in my opinion, is the most important and the one that we should pay the most attention to, especially in the year 2021. Mess up number 3 was referred to as not using tier 1 for primary prevention. And there was a quote that Stephanie used in her presentation that I pulled out here for you. Her quote was, "You can't intervene your way out of a core instruction problem." And I truly believe that our teachers in the classroom are going to find themselves in the year 2021 and 2022 finding that our core instruction needs to be looked at so that we can meet students where they are and make sure that we're giving them the instruction that they need in that tier 1 for that primary prevention. Because if 40% of our students are not reaching the goal in our tier 1 primary prevention program, then we really need to evaluate that core program. All kids don't leave for tier 2. So if we're benchmarking and we find that unfortunately we're not seeing that 80% at benchmark, instead we're seeing more like a 40% or a 60%, it really needs to be evaluated on your tier 1 then. We need to make sure that we have knowledgeable teachers in the classroom that are following that systematic scope and sequence. We need to make sure that they're explicitly teaching and that their teaching is guided by their data that they're seeing from their students. This requires highly differentiated instruction and making sure that our primary reading is at least 90 to 120 minutes of a block of reading time per day. This is an example from Acadian's data management, and this is an example of your universal screening data that you could get from the beginning of the year. So if you look at this example that Stephanie provided in her presentation, you can see that in the reading composite score, they were only showing that 56% of their students were at or above benchmark. So at this point, this teacher should really go back to their scores in each measure and analyze where am I seeing the most significant gaps and how can I change my core instruction to prevent the reading failure for my students. All right, moving on to mess up number 4, not using a collaborative problem-solving process. So as you might share the same opinion that I do, we assess our students constantly, sometimes more than necessary. We need to make sure as educators that we're collecting data that we're actually using. So we don't want to get stuck in the process of collecting data that we don't need or collecting data that we don't use. Every time an assessment is taken by a teacher, their responsibility is to analyze that data and help it improve their instruction. So the analogy that Stephanie used in her presentation was that of the second bullet there. You can give a fish or you can teach them to fish, correct? So I can give a student information. I can give them knowledge of a process or a system. However, if I teach them how to get to that solution on their own, then they're going to be able to do it independently when it comes time to do that. This is an example of using a collaborative problem solving. So a 4-step process. Step 1, asking what is the problem. Step 2, talking about it as a team. Why is it occurring? Is it a behavior issue? Is it a phonetic issue? Is it a phonological issue? Step 3, asking and putting your heads together. What are we going to do about it? What interventions can we put into place? What behavior plans can we put into place? You know, really having that team conversation. And finally, making sure we're evaluating along the way, not waiting until the end of the marking period to say, oh, did that work for them? But really making sure we're doing that progress monitoring along the way to see if it's working. So there you can see that this is used at the district level. It can be used at the school level. You can even drill down to individual student levels, like I was explaining, how you can use this collaborative problem solving process. Back to this outcomes driven model, because I feel it's very similar. Again, this is from Acadian's reading, but identifying that need for support and validating it with data. Then that green box at the bottom there really has that revolving door of we're planning, we're implementing, and we're checking to see if it's effective. So I just wanted to review that with you as well. And the final one, mess up number 5, is using placement and special education as the solution. We want to make sure that if we are ready for multi-tiered systems of support, that we are not using the same old eligibility or discrepancy model to decide on whether there's a specific learning disability. We want to make sure that we are progress monitoring along the way, like I explained, to find out what works first, and making sure that we're using that multi-tiered systems of support along the way to change our intervention if we're not seeing the rate of improvement where we want it to be. This is an example, again, from Acadience Reading, where you can see the large blue boxes at the top talk about the 5 pillars of reading, and then the arrows that are going down to more of the dark purple are related to the measures that Acadience Reading uses to monitor those pillars. And you can see down at the bottom in the green, there's a timeline there that runs from kindergarten to 3rd grade, 6th grade technically, that talks to you about where the benchmark cutoff scores are. So these really drill down to those essential reading skills. And we do have students still in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade that are struggling with being proficient on their outcomes. And if we use things like Acadience Reading, we can really find where those gaps are. And using the progress monitoring, we can find out if our instruction and our intervention is working to fill those gaps. This is an example, again, from Acadience Data Management that is a classroom report. You can see that I've highlighted the 2 students at the top there because we really need to make sure that if our students are having difficulty with essential reading skills, that we're going back to the root of the problem. We're including in our interventions phonemic awareness, we're including phonics, we're including those alphabetic principles with those students in their interventions. In Acadience Data Management, there are wonderful graphs that can help you progress monitor along the way. If you look at the student at the very top, Evelyn is making below typical progress, or what we can also say well below typical progress, even with changes in instruction to meet her needs. So as a team, we would have to talk about what could we change that we're doing for Evelyn, because what we're doing is not helping her with her rate of improvement. The graph at the bottom is for a student named Otis, and you can see Otis, however, is making typical progress or above typical progress with what we've changed in our instruction or our support. So knowing that and seeing that data tells our team that the interventions we have in place are working and that we need to continue. So this is really a wonderful tool that Acadience Data Management offers to allow you to see your intervention success and effectiveness. The third defining indicator or risk for dyslexia and other reading difficulties is evidence that classroom instruction or intervention is generally effective. Here are some examples. We need to know that schools are generally effective in getting more and more students on track for these reading outcomes. And how can we do that? The things we just talked about this prior. We need to have evidence that students are making that adequate progress using those data management graphs that I just shared. We need to make sure that we have evidence that students who are likely to need that strategic and intensive support are getting the time and the extra intervention that they need. And finally, that intervention group that they're in is effective and that we're checking to see if that intervention is working. When we provide with this effective instruction, we're hopeful that we're going to see at least 80% of our students in core instruction receiving that proficient or at benchmark goal. We obviously would like to have 100% of our students reach goal to benchmark goals, but this is just looking at our multi-tiered systems of support and where we can make our goal setting. So just to leave you with some big ideas, MTSS is about systems change, doing business differently, wanting a better outcome, making sure we're using the collaborative problem solving at all levels, making sure we're looking at our instruction and matching it to the needs as early as possible for our students, providing the least amount of intervention that will get our results for our students, making sure we're focusing on prevention, getting it right with the first instruction, really strengthening the core in our classrooms, and finally, finding what works to enable the success of our students. If you have any questions regarding implementing multi-tiered systems of support or anything that I spoke of on this Online Learning Hub webinar, please feel free to let me know. There is a feedback form link there for you in the presentation. I would love to know your feedback or any needs that you need, have moving forward. And finally, this is my contact information. Again, my email is ehamilton@iu17.org. Feel free to contact me at any time with any questions that you have or any way that I can be helpful to you or your district.